When actress Louise Fletcher passed away in 2022, her Beverly Hills home tucked high in the hills near Mulholland Drive sat quietly for almost a year. The Mediterranean-style property had been her refuge since the early 1980s, a place of privacy and calm. The house itself, built in the late 1940s, had changed hands only twice before Fletcher bought it. But by the time it hit the market in 2023, there were whispers. Neighbors said she'd grown reclusive in her final years. One gardener refused to work there after dusk. But nothing concrete, just Hollywood talk. In early 2024, the house was bought by James and Allison Kramer, a couple in their late 30s who had recently moved from Denver with their 5-year-old son, Milo. James was an entertainment lawyer, Allison a freelance editor. They wanted charm, character, and history. The Fletcher house had all three, along with original hardwood floors, wrought iron railings, and a study with floor-to-ceiling windows that looked out over the canyons. At first, the family loved it. The house needed minor renovations, but it felt like old Hollywood, Allison wrote in her blog. She even turned Louise's old study into her office. There were still shelves of books left behind, some with Fletcher's handwritten notes. Allison kept them. But by June, strange things started happening. The first week it rained, Allison noticed the curtains in the master bedroom would be drawn shut every morning, even though she left them open at night. She thought James was doing it until he swore he wasn't. Milo began waking up crying, saying there was a woman in his room. Not a monster, not a shadow, a woman. He said she didn't move, just stood near the closet, watching. One night, James came down to the kitchen around 2 a.m. for water. He paused halfway down the stairs. The living room light was on. He could see someone sitting on the couch, just the outline of a figure. A woman with short hair, motionless. By the time he turned the corner, the room was empty. No one had broken in. Nothing was stolen. They installed security cameras. Nothing ever showed up. It was the study where things escalated. Allison, who worked from home most days, began to feel like she wasn't alone in the room. It started with the radio. Fletcher had left behind an old Zenith tabletop radio, just a prop now. One afternoon in July, it turned on by itself. Full volume. Static. When Allison approached it, the dial spun just for a moment and then stopped. She unplugged it. That same night, while reviewing copy for a client, she noticed something written in the margins of a book on her desk. It wasn't her handwriting. The words were, "You're in my chair." She didn't mention it to James. Not at first. But 2 days later, she came home from dropping Milo at daycare and found the same phrase written in the steam on the bathroom mirror. "You're in my chair." James found a locked door in the basement during some light renovations in August. The realtor had told them the door was stuck from moisture damage. He broke the lock. Inside was a small, windowless room. It looked like a private archive. Binders of scripts, fan letters, dozens of VHS tapes labeled with dates, some labeled simply therapy. There was also a single wooden chair facing a mirror. On the mirror's surface were scratch marks, as if someone had dragged a key across it over and over. Allison refused to enter the room. James began to digitize some of the tapes, curious. Most were innocuous interviews, old press footage, one from the set of One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. But one tape, dated 1994, showed Louise sitting in the mirror chair, staring into the lens. She said only one thing. "I didn't mean to make her quiet. I just wanted her gone." Then silence. The tape ended. By September, Milo had stopped sleeping in his room altogether. He started dragging his blanket into the hallway every night, claiming the mirror lady didn't like him. One evening, Allison caught him talking to someone in the corner of the living room. When she asked who, he whispered, "Lou." But she says I shouldn't call her that. He had drawn pictures. A woman with short, tidy hair, always frowning. One drawing showed her sitting at the edge of his bed, her hands folded in her lap. The word "no" was scrawled repeatedly in red crayon all over the background. Allison broke down. That same night, the family heard footsteps in the attic, slow, deliberate. James went up to check and found nothing but dust and the heavy silence of wood that hadn't been touched in decades. They brought in a psychic. Not for show. Not for novelty. Just desperation. The woman, who had worked on multiple hauntings in Los Angeles, refused to stay more than an hour. She claimed the energy in the house was conflicted. She said Fletcher hadn't left. But it wasn't fame or legacy that held her, it was guilt. The psychic stood in the study, eyes closed, and said, "She feels judged. Still. Even now. But someone else is here too. A girl. Young. Mute. Louise keeps her here. Keeps her quiet." The Kramers left that night. The house remains empty. The real estate listing was pulled in December 2024. No sale. No explanation. Neighbors say the lights still come on in the middle of the night. Some delivery drivers refuse to walk up the driveway. A local teen who broke in on a dare said he saw a woman sitting in a chair by the window, looking out over the city. When police came, the house was empty but the chair had been moved. Some say it was all stress. Others say fame leaves shadows. But those who knew Louise Fletcher say she was always haunted by the roles she played. That nurse Ratched never really left her. And maybe she never really left that house either. Don't forget to subscribe and like if you liked this story. By late January, after the holidays had passed and the street fell back into its quiet rhythm, the house on Overland Ridge stood still again, shutters drawn, mailbox sealed, the ivy creeping a little higher along the stone columns near the gate. Real estate websites still listed the property as temporarily off-market. But behind the scenes, a quiet transaction had taken place. The buyer was a man named Kenneth Elroy, 62. A semi-retired film archivist who'd spent decades restoring lost reels and cleaning nitrate from forgotten basements in Culver City. Elroy wasn't rich, but he had inherited just enough from an aunt in Pasadena to make a strange, sentimental purchase. He wasn't interested in flipping homes or chasing property trends. He bought the Fletcher house for one reason. He was obsessed with film history, especially the kind that had been lost. He moved in alone, in the last week of February, bringing only books, real cases, and a cat named June. His plan was to live quietly and begin work cataloging what the Kramers had left behind in the basement. Those tapes, the binders, the therapy sessions. What others saw as eerie he saw as important. The house, to him, wasn't haunted. It was archived. The interior had a dryness to it that Elroy didn't expect. Not just from disuse, but something more elemental. The kind of still air you find in funeral homes or old theaters just before the curtain rises. It didn't smell musty, but rather antiseptic, like the ghost of bleach lingered faintly in the walls. He noticed quickly that sound didn't travel well in the house. His footsteps were always absorbed, muffled by the high ceilings and thick carpets. And even June, who was a vocal cat, seemed to lose interest in meowing. She began to trail him in silence, her tail low, her ears alert to corners he thought were empty. Elroy set up his workspace in the former study, the same one Allison had used, the one Fletcher had once called her reading room. Outside the windows, the canyons were gray and green with low fog that clung to the treetops. He worked mostly at night, poring over binders, labeling tapes, digitizing footage. And within weeks, he began to notice patterns. In almost every home interview Louise Fletcher gave from that house across years, even decades, there were always two chairs visible in the background. The velvet armchair near the window, and the wooden one by the mirror. But in some clips, there was a third. A narrow-backed chair with no cushion, always appearing out of frame for a few seconds before vanishing in the next cut. At first, Elroy thought it was a continuity error or poor editing. But the more he watched, the more he realized that the chair was never moved. It simply blinked in and out of existence, as if it were only visible to the camera when no one was looking directly at it. And then, during a tape labeled August 3rd, 98 Personal, Louise broke her pattern. She wasn't speaking to a host or interview crew. The footage was private, just her, seated in the study, whispering. She was 12. She lived here before me. The papers were sealed. I didn't know when I signed. But she never left. She never left. And I used her, didn't I? I made her quiet. And that made me louder. At this point, her expression shifted, not sadness. Contempt. She wanted to be seen. That was her mistake. The camera lingered on her face for a long time. And in the final frame, Elroy swore he saw a reflection in the window behind her. A girl. Standing. Pale dress. No face, only shadow. By mid-March, Elroy began waking up at precisely 4:11 a.m. He didn't set an alarm. There was no sound. No dream. Just sudden alertness, always at that same moment, with a film of sweat on his chest and the feeling of eyes watching from the hallway. June, who once slept curled beside him, now slept in the closet, hidden behind an old suitcase. He began documenting the time, the temperature, even ambient sounds. He left an old cassette recorder running through the night. And on March 17th, at exactly 4:11 a.m., the recorder captured a voice. Soft, raspy, female. It said, "Don't digitize me." Elroy played it back 3 times. The 4th time, the tape jammed. He opened the machine and found the ribbon inside had been pulled out, not cut. Pulled. Like a claw had reached in and unspooled it. He stopped recording after that. The basement door, long ignored, called to him in a way he couldn't explain. He had avoided it, telling himself the space wasn't needed. But he knew what lay behind it. The mirror, the chair, the place Allison had refused to enter. On March 29th, he finally went in. The air in the room was thick, like it hadn't been touched in years, though it had been opened less than a year ago. Dust hung suspended in the beam of his flashlight. The mirror had new scratches on it, fresh, sharp lines that hadn't been there in Allison's photographs. The chair, still in the center, seemed to have moved slightly, now turned to face the door. Elroy sat in it. He didn't know why he did. The moment he did, his skin went cold, not from the chair's wood, but something deeper, internal, like heat had been drawn from his spine. And then, for the first time in his life, he heard breathing from behind the glass. Not his own. Measured, shallow, panicked breathing. He didn't move. Couldn't. The next day, in the attic, he found a shoebox tucked inside the vent shaft. Letters, folded tightly, many of them unopened. They were addressed not to Louise, but to a name Elroy didn't recognize. Eleanor Reed. The postmarks were from 1963. They spoke of a missing daughter, desperation, mental institutions, a mother pleading for forgiveness. One letter read, "She never spoke after that night. I should have protected her. I should never have left her in that house. But if she's still there, please let her go." Elroy felt it in his gut. This wasn't just a haunting. It was a containment. April came to the canyon with cool winds and the scent of orange blossoms drifting from the valley below. But inside the Fletcher house, spring never quite arrived. The air remained dry, sour, and cold. The sunlight that did manage to filter through the living room windows was dull, as if it passed through a veil. Elroy had stopped opening the curtains altogether. He claimed it helped with digitizing the tapes, but the real reason lay deeper. He didn't like what the glass reflected. By the second week of April, a smell began to emerge. Faint at first, like rust, or wet coins. It lingered strongest in the study, and at night it seemed to drift through the hallway, seeping under closed doors like a fog. June, the cat, began to scratch obsessively at the baseboards. Always in the same place, just below the bookshelf where the floor creaked beneath a certain loose plank. Elroy had no reason to lift it. He didn't want to, but he did. The board came up easily. Beneath it was a hollow space, maybe 2 feet deep. Not a crawl space, just an old builder's gap between the foundation and the first layer of flooring. Inside, wrapped in faded newspaper and decayed silk, was a bundle of objects. Porcelain doll's head, cracked across one cheek, its mouth frozen in a small O. A ring, likely silver, inscribed with the initials E.R. Pair of child's leather shoes, dried stiff, the stitching almost gone. And last, pressed flat against the bottom, was a photo, black and white, almost stuck to the wood from time and moisture. It showed a girl, no more than 10, braided hair, hollow eyes. She wasn't smiling. In the corner was a date, handwritten in blue ink, May 12, 1959. Elroy stared at the photograph for a long time, and though he couldn't explain why, he felt watched as he did. Not from behind, but from beneath. He put everything back. But the smell never left. The tapes became harder to watch. Not because they were violent or disturbing, but because they began to change. There were subtle differences. In one, a clip he had watched weeks earlier, an old screen test, Louise Fletcher sat at her usual angle, head tilted slightly to the left, reading dialogue. She wore a blue blouse. Elroy remembered it clearly. But now she wore white, and the dialogue was different, shorter, colder, and someone else spoke at the end. A voice. Young. Female. Faint. "You're still playing me." He rewound it 3 times. It never repeated. The voice didn't come back. But he knew what he'd heard. That night, he walked through the hallway in silence, checking each door, switching off lights he didn't remember turning on. When he reached the guest bedroom, the one the Kramers had sealed off after Milo refused to sleep there, he paused. The door was slightly ajar. Inside, the air was still. No sound. No movement. But on the bed, perfectly placed at the center of the quilt, was the photo he had found under the floorboards. The girl. Only now the image was darker. Her face smudged with soot. Her mouth gone. It happened the night after the photo moved. At 4:11 a.m., Elroy woke not from sound, but from the unmistakable pressure of something in the room. Not presence. Wait. The air was thick. Every breath like trying to inhale underwater. He sat up slowly. In the corner near the closet stood a figure. Still. Pale. Her arms by her side. Her face was turned to the wall, and she didn't move, not even when June darted from under the bed with a hiss and fled down the hall. Elroy's throat tightened. He didn't shout. Couldn't. His mouth wouldn't open. He tried to stand, but the moment he shifted, she moved. Not walked, shifted. Like a sudden flicker of light, she was closer. 2 feet from the end of the bed, still not facing him. Her shoulders narrow. Her dress old-fashioned, creased, like it had been folded in a drawer for decades. Then she turned her head, not fully, just enough for him to see one side of her face. It was blank, featureless, like wax left in the sun. Then she was gone. In the days that followed, Elroy stopped working. He barely ate. The tape sat untouched on the desk. June no longer entered the study. She slept now in the laundry room, behind the dryer, refusing to come out except to eat. Elroy spent most of his time in the basement, not because he wanted to, but because something drew him there. He had begun peeling back the wallpaper along the stairwell, convinced there was something behind it. He was right. Behind the second layer of plaster was a note, faded, folded tightly, wedged between the studs of the wall. It was handwritten in a tight, looping script. I heard her breathing through the vents. For weeks, she never moved, just breathed. And when I stopped answering her, she came to my room. I begged them to believe me, but no one did. They said I was delusional, that the girl I saw had died in 1959. But I saw her, every night, in the mirror, watching me become her. The signature at the bottom was unmistakable. Louise Fletcher. Elroy's face changed over the course of the next month. Neighbors who'd only glimpsed him during his first weeks walking to the mailbox, unloading crates from his old Buick, noticed that he no longer left the house. One gardener, working at a nearby property, said he saw him once through the lace curtains of the kitchen, standing motionless at the sink, not washing anything, not moving, just staring into the window as if something stared back. By May 4th, no one had seen him at all. But lights came on at night, and only in the basement. When the police finally entered the house, prompted by an anonymous welfare check, likely from his sister in Altadena, the air inside was cold. The type of cold that comes not from temperature, but from withdrawal. As though warmth had been sucked out over time and nothing was left to take. The living room looked untouched. Furniture covered in white sheets. Not staged, just forgotten. The study was worse. Disheveled. Books toppled. Tapes half unspooled across the floor like vines. The smell of oxidized metal lingered heavily in the air, like old blood. The final room they searched was the basement. They descended slowly. 2 officers, both young, both used to calls like this, lonely men losing their minds in big houses. But the deeper they went, the quieter everything became. Their radios began to fuzz out. The mirror was still there, but it was cracked now, fine, spreading fractures like a spider's web. In the center of the floor sat the wooden chair, and behind it, facing the wall, was Kenneth Elroy. At first, they thought he was dead, but then they saw his fingers twitch. He was breathing barely, eyes wide open, unmoving, unblinking, mouth half open as if mid-sentence, and scrawled across the walls in fading charcoal or maybe ash were words, repeating over and over in looping cursive. "Let her speak. Let her speak. Let her speak." Elroy never spoke again. The hospital labeled it catatonic dissociative state. No signs of brain trauma, no drugs in his system. But even when nurses tried to move his arms, he resisted, not physically, but as if something else effused. He would only sit, facing the nearest wall. They found nothing criminal in the house. No signs of intruders, no bodies, no trespassing. But the tapes, something was wrong. When investigators tried to review them, they were blank. Not damaged, erased. Even the ones Elroy had digitized were empty. Each file opened into static or long, black screens. Except for one. A short clip, 42 seconds. No audio. Just a young girl sitting in the chair in the basement, staring into the lens. Her face flickered between frames, sometimes normal, sometimes shadowed, sometimes gone. Behind her, for a single frame, a faint reflection appeared in the mirror. Louise Fletcher. Eyes closed, head bowed, mouthing something. Frame by frame, they examined it but could never agree on the words. Some said it looked like, "She isn't me." Others saw, "She made me her." But most disturbing was this. In the final second of the clip, the girl in the chair smiled just slightly. And the camera angle, which had been fixed, moved downward, as if someone else were now watching through her eyes. The house was sealed, the mirrors removed. But in the years that followed, no buyer would stay longer than a season. Doors locked themselves. Footsteps echoed in the day. Children who visited refused to go near the basement stairs. One painter quit mid-job, refusing to finish the upstairs guest room. He said he kept hearing humming behind the walls. A woman's voice, off-key, like a lullaby dragged out too slowly. As of today, the house remains vacant, but lights still flicker on at night. And if you pass by the narrow side window near the basement stairs just quickly enough, you might see a reflection that doesn't match the room. Pale face, parted mouth, not smiling, just watching, as if still waiting to be heard. Don't forget to subscribe and like if you liked this story.